Is there a plug over there? One free one?
Just crack up and run One more? Okay. Now you're probably curious why I just gave you a bunch of stuff. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to talk about the differences in role and responsibilities of wildlife veterinarians and zoo veterinarians. Maybe a couple of them. You probably have been confused. People may have been confused that you are a zoo vet, or zoo vets may have been confused with wildlife vet. There's a lot of things that may be in common. But I want to get your perspective on what you think the roles and responsibilities are of each. Some of them may have the same. Some of them This is what I'd like you to do. Use on the yellow and the orange pieces of paper. On each one, I want you to write a role or a responsibility of a wildlife vet. Just one. So if you say, track animals in the wild, just one per piece of paper. Okay? Only on the yellow and the orange for wildlife vet. If you have a green or pink piece of paper, I want you to write one role or responsibility of a zoo vet. Okay? So if you have yellow or orange, write one role or one responsibility of a wildlife vet. And if you have pink or green, you're going to write one role or one responsibility of a zoo vet. Everybody get it? No? No. Dave, do you want to see in Minnesota?
Why do you have two colors for each one?
Because I didn't bring enough pen and paper.
Now you do.
It's tricky. We're going to start you off.
I'm saying Rivera and use a translator.
Depending on what color they have in their budget.
ก็คือว่าคุณแนนซี่นะคะบอกว่าเดี๋ยวให้น้องนะคะแต่ละคนก็เดี๋ยวเขียนบนกระดาษที่ตัวเองมีอยู่นะคะว่าคิดว่า wildlife vet นะคะควรต้องทำอะไรบ้างเขียนเป็นอย่างนะคะแล้วก็ zoo vet ควรต้องทำอะไรบ้างตามความคิดของเรานะคะหนึ่งอย่างบนกระดาษที่ตัวเองได้นะคะโอเคไหมคะมีคำถามไหม
Okay. Wait, I'm not going to. Wait, After you put one up, of whatever color you have in front of you. If you have a yellow or an orange, I want you to then find a pink or a green and write a role or responsibility of a do vet. So I want you to do one of each, but you need to find the right color. That one you really need to have.
already said it. Scott at more detail. ก็เดี๋ยวให้เอาตรงนี้เราเห็นว่ามันมีสีแยกอยู่แล้วนะคะ
เอาใช้ไมโครโฟน
เรามีสีแยกอยู่แล้วเนาะสำหรับWildlife Vet นะคะ น้องก็ให้ใช้สีน้ำเงิน ขอให้น้องใช้สีน้ำเงินนะคะ แล้วก็เดี๋ยวสิ่งที่น้องเขียนเอามาติดไว้ตรงนี้ ส่วน True Vet นะคะ ขอให้ใช้สีชมพูนะคะ แล้วก็เป็นสีบนนู้นโอเคไหมคะ
Did you get that they have to agree to different ones?
คนเขียนแผ่นแยกต่างหากนะคะสำหรับความคิดของน้องว่าดูเวทควรจะทำอะไรแล้วก็ไวไลฟ์เวทควรจะทำอะไรแยกกัน1 แผ่น 1ไอเดียโอเคไหมคะโอเค
We are going to take the easiest differences. Okay, so we all know that wildlife veterinarians work with free-ranging populations in the wild, and zoo veterinarians work with captive animals. So I'm going to put those two up there, so you have to think of something else.
ก็เดี๋ยวคุณเซริเชียจะให้ตัวอย่าง2 อันนะคะว่าสำหรับไวไลฟ์เวทเนี่ยเขาจะทำงานกับพวกประชากรที่อยู่ในป่านะคะในสัตว์ก็คือสัตว์ป่าส่วนซูเวทเนี่ยก็จะทำงานกับสัตว์ในเมืองนะคะ
Something more specific. We want very specific roles. So this is a very general difference.
This is a very general difference between wildlife vet and zoo vet. We want you to think about more specific roles and responsibilities for each type of job.
Okay, any questions?
ถามได้ไหมคะจะให้ก็ได้เขียนที่อธิบายไปแล้วไม่ใช่เรื่องการแบบนี้ค่ะก็คือให้เขียนไอเดียของเราว่าอันนี้ควรจะทำอะไรแล้วก็อันนี้ควรจะทำอะไรมีบทบาทความรับผิดชอบหรือเกี่ยวข้องอะไรกับใครบ้างนะครับ
So that means the people who have the yellow and orange will write their role and then look for.
You're going to write the role of wildlife vet?
Yes, I know that. Okay, you know, and then they have to look for the different colors and write them on.
That's correct.
Keep with themselves.
That's correct.
And you will let them.
Well, they're going to stick them up there when she's ready.
After finition.
That's right. Okay.
งั้นแบบของทีมก่อนเนาะ
เขาได้สีของเขาอะค่ะไม่รู้ว่าจะเขียนโรของเขาตามสีเสร็จแล้วเขาก็จะเปลี่ยนไปวิ่งหาที่สีอื่นที่เขาไม่มีแล้วก็เขียนโรของเขาเขียนโรเขาลงไปอีกเสร็จแล้วก็ไปติด
พูดข้างหน้ามาตั้งแต่
ส่งก็จะคือถ้าพี่ได้สมมติว่าพี่ได้สีส้มกับสีเหลืองใช่ไหมคะพี่ก็จะเริ่มลงมือเขียนโรของพี่โรของไวไลฟ์เวทลงไปเสร็จแล้วพอเขียนตรงนี้เสร็จคนที่ได้สีเหลืองกับสีส้มก็จะวิ่งไปดูไปหาเพื่อนที่มีสีเขียวกับสีชมพูแล้วก็เขียนโรของซูเวทลงไปแล้วก็เอาไปติดเพราะฉะนั้นทุกคนจะต้องเขียนทั้ง2โรเนาะเพียงแต่ว่าตอนนี้เราเริ่มจากสีที่เรามีอยู่ใช่ไหมคะนึกออกเนาะโอเคคำถาม
Okay, everybody good?
ใช่ไหมคะ
Okay, 5 minutes start.
จับเวลาด้วย5 นาที5 นาที
อย่าเล่าตอนต้องมีเพื่อนเขียนถูกต้องไม่ถูกน้องผิดแต่แย่หน้าที่ความรับผิดชอบตลอดมีมาแล้วน่าจะที่ว่าพอแล้วต้องการแล้วจะทำอะไรว่าจะถูกค่ะใครก็ได้ค่ะถ้าเกิดว่าคะแนนไม่สะดวกเดี๋ยวแต่ถูกว่าไม่รู้เดี๋ยวให้ถึงแปด
ที่ห้องพักเสร็จแล้วไปแปะเลยนะครับว่าน้ำนี้
อย่าฟังแปดรู้เลยแปดวันแรกกันเลยนะคะคุณ ใช่แปลมาก็บอกว่าสนกันนิดนึงดูว่า
บนสถานแต่นะครับแต่
All right, then, birthday.
ไม่ออก
เดี๋ยวโตหน่อยก็ได้นะครับเดี๋ยวโตหน่อยก็ได้นะครับโอ้ขยายหน่อยก็ได้ไม่เขียนไปเลยขยายไปเลย
เสน่ห์ครับเสน่ห์ออกยากครับ
เสน่ห์ออกยากมากให้เสน่ห์เขียนดีกว่า
2 minutes.
TikTok
I know, somebody wrote it out.
เขียนอะไรเยอะแยะไม่ใช่ไหมแผ่นเดียวไม่พอมากเลยแฮปปี้ค่ะ
คนที่ทำ
ออกง่ายออกไปเอาแล้วนะมั่ว
มันก็ทำกันว่า
หมดเวลาแล้วนะคะ5 นาทีค่ะ
หมดเวลาปากกา
One more minute.
อีก1 นาทีนะครับ
เอาเวลา
Anybody else? We'll always take more. Let's get pen in here. More?
มีใครไม่ได้เป็นไหมคะ
If you have more ideas than 2, it's okay, because it will help as well.
ถ้าเกิดว่าเรามีมากกว่า1 ไอเดียอยากจะเพิ่มก็โอเคมีใครจะเพิ่มไหมคะมีนะเอ่ย
So do you see anything missing?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, now Alicia and Dr. Partek are going to walk you through some of the gaps, as well as some of the similarities. Okay, so they're trying to classify them, but also putting common pieces in the middle. So roles and responsibilities that are common between the two are going to go in the center. But it's fun to watch them talk through it.
I don't want to laugh. Okay, on that side. Education is more than one party.
Right. know this is riveting to watch, but we'll get finished.
I can correct you later on.
You can correct me, okay. I'll give you the microphone.
No, please do this because you are on camera.
Okay, so for a very fast month,
No.
How about now? For a very fast exercise, you only had 5 minutes. You did a very good job coming up with many of the differences. And you can see in the middle, we have put things that are similarities and overlaps in the job between a zoo veterinarian and a wildlife veterinarian, because there are overlaps. So starting with the zoo veterinarians, who are really charged with taking care of captive animals. The animals are in a captive setting, and so the veterinarians, the keepers, are completely responsible for that animal's health and well-being and nutrition. So that's a very big responsibility. And I'm glad to see that you put make suitable and comfortable exhibition and cage. So that is looking out for the animal's welfare, to make sure that as much as possible the environment they have in captivity is as close to possible as the wild, so that they are free from anxiety and stress. So that's very good. And then there are many things that you listed that are part of preventive medicine, making sure that the animals are as healthy as possible. That includes nutrition. Nutrition is really one of the major causes, poor nutrition is one of the major causes of health problems in captive animals. And so that's good that you have that as a main responsibility for the vet. To work in collaboration with nutritionists and also with biologists that know what the species consumes in the wild. So it takes a team to try to replicate or make sure that the animal in captivity has the same diet. Other parts of caring for captive animals you've also listed: preventative health care, an annual exam for the animals, which includes what? What is part of an annual exam? Someone tell me what you do? I know that there have just been exams for 70 tigers at the Tiger Temple.
Yeah. From the blood. And you keep details of it. Come on.
Yeah.
What is included in an annual exam?
ที่ดู
No.
ก็ที่ตรวจสุขภาพวัดหลวงตาที่วัดเสือมีใช่ไหมคะก็จะมีแบบสุขภาพทั่วไปค่ะพวกวิตามินซีบัตรเคมแล้วก็จะเป็นตรวจโรคติดเชื้อทางแมวพวกทอคโซพลาสมา FPLV FIV FIP แล้วก็มีฟีไลน์แคลิซี่แล้วก็ฟีไลน์เฮอร์ปีแล้วก็มีตัวมี7โรคแคลิซี่นะคะ
ค่ะในโรค HIV โรค7 โรคเป็นโรคติดเชื้อ7 โรคค่ะแล้วก็ตรวจสุขภาพทั่วไปตรวจตับไตnutritional disease ตรวจแค่เหมือนสำรวจแคลเซียมค่ะแล้วก็เป็นข้างนอกแล้วก็ตรวจตาค่ะตรวจตา
Check for parasites. Thank you.
So those are things that we do for animals in captivity, but by and large not for animals in the wild, in free-ranging populations. There are some mentions here for captive animals of breeding, for reintroduction, or to make sure the captive population is robust and healthy. And so you want to avoid inbreeding. Clearly treatment for any animals that are sick. So there is ongoing monitoring of the health of animals in captivity and surveillance for disease. We know we've had problems with captive animals in zoos actually serving as almost as sentinels for avian influenza, both birds and also animals that were consuming poultry or bird meat. So I think, is genetic management there? I think it is, yes. We mentioned that about breeding properly. And that may include not breeding them at all. So, okay, some of the main, so anything we're missing, Dr. Parta? So far not yet, okay. So we'll move to wildlife veterinarians. The major difference is that wildlife veterinarians work with free-ranging animals in the wild. And so those animals are in populations in natural settings where they are also in contact with many other species of wildlife and sometimes livestock and people. So it's a very different setting from the zoo where you can control, for the most part, what animals are in contact with each other. In the wild, that's something that is very difficult to do. So some of the main responsibilities of a wildlife veterinarian are health monitoring, disease surveillance or health monitoring of animals in the wild, to look for any evidence of unusual new diseases. So we have emerging diseases mentioned, but also there is natural disease and expected disease or expected death in wild animals, and it's often very important to investigate the causes of this death, to find out if the death is from something that is expected in that population or if it's something new. And so necropsy, forensics, collecting samples is very important. And it's important for a wildlife veterinarian to understand basic principles of epidemiology, which in wildlife is different from in livestock or from people. And we'll talk about that some in the course of this workshop and in others. It is mentioned here that there is a role for wildlife veterinarians in rehabilitation or treatment of individual cases of animals. And so there are some times when treatment of individual animals in the wild is appropriate, and there are other times when it's really not appropriate, because we're working with populations of animals. And if the population is large enough and healthy, then each individual animal may not be so important. But in populations of endangered species or threatened species that are very small, each individual animal may be very important. And so you have to weigh those considerations when you're considering treating a single animal in the wild. It takes a lot of resources to treat an animal in the wild, because it's not like a zoo where you can plan, Tuesday at 10 a.m. I'm going to anesthetize a tiger. You can ask Dave how many times he waits and how long it takes him to catch a tiger sometimes.
2 years.
2 years. Yeah, so it takes a lot more effort to catch an animal in the wild than in a zoo. And so you have to plan accordingly with treatment. Genetic management is mentioned here, and I'm glad you have that there. That's an important part of conservation, especially of small populations. There are species of animals where the populations are so small in the wild, and the genetics are inbred in those small populations, where you have to translocate animals from one population to another to improve the genetics of the population. So those are all important roles that play into conservation. And making contributions to wildlife management, again, as part of a team. Wildlife vets are always working as part of a team in the field, with biologists, with national park rangers and trackers. I've never, ever worked on my own as a wildlife vet. I'm always part of a team, and so that's critical. I think one thing that is missing here from wildlife veterinarian is playing a role in helping to manage wildlife, human, livestock conflict. Yeah? Okay, so we know there's problems with animals raiding crops, into villages, and that's an important role for a wildlife vet to play. There are some other roles and responsibilities here in the middle that Dr. Parntep and I think are shared between a wildlife vet and a zoo vet. So there are places where the line is not so clear, and that's for taking care of confiscated wildlife. Okay? So it depends on when animals are confiscated, do they go into captivity to a rehabilitation center, a breeding center, or a zoo? And so this is often a place where wildlife vets and zoo vets are working together. Same here, taking care of wildlife cases till they're finished. Breeding for wildlife or releasing wildlife to nature. This means that the wildlife has been in captivity if you're going to release them to nature. And so that is an area for the captive vet, so the zoo vet and the wildlife vet to work together. Because the zoo vet needs to be sure the animals are generally healthy. The wildlife vet will be part of making sure that the animal that's planned to be reintroduced is from the right genetics population, and that it is not going to be bringing diseases into the wild. So you have to actually survey the wild population where you're going to be reintroducing an animal to see what diseases are there. Very expensive, very complicated, but that's the right way to do reintroduction. And then we have education for wildlife farming. This is a big area where wildlife vets and captive vets need to collaborate, because wildlife veterinarians and biologists will know more about the animals in the wild and what they need in the wild, and the captive animal veterinarians will know more about captivity. So together, they can make a much better team to educate about wildlife farming and doing that humanely. So, anything missing? No. Okay. I think you did a great job on coming up with the different roles and responsibilities. So, thank you very much. Are there any questions? Everything clear?
เดี๋ยวเข้าไปด่าได้นะลุง
Are there any questions from this exercise? Everybody understands perfectly? Good. Okay. So Dr. Partap asked me to speak to you and give you some examples of my experience working as a wildlife veterinarian. Some of the different roles and responsibilities I've had, and the different species that I've worked with, to give you an idea and a better understanding of the things that you can do and that's possible for you to do in your job. And I'm trying a new type of presentation software, so we'll see how it goes. And please, if I speak too fast, slow down, and if you're not understanding, okay? I really want to make sure that if you have questions also, as I'm talking, please just ask the question. Don't wait till the end. Just raise your hand or ask the question whenever you think of it. That's better, because you won't remember if you try to wait till the end.
You did a fast
here?
Yeah. From your so-called.
Am I blocking the way? Okay.
อันเนี้ยเหรอเครื่องนู้นมันไม่มีบันได
Okay. So some of the things I want to explain to you and help illustrate about the roles and responsibilities I've had as a wildlife vet are these things. There are thousands of species of wildlife, right? Thousands of mammals, birds, snakes, frogs, thousands. How many species did we study in veterinary school? How many species? We studied dogs and cats, horses, chickens, cows, pigs, horse, elephants, only in Thailand. I wish, yeah. Fish, we study fish, okay. Maybe, what else? Reptiles, okay. But maybe 10 or 15 species, not thousands. So, but the strength of our training as veterinarians is that we are trained to think comparatively. We are trained to think across many different species and to be competent with many different species. And so, if I'm going to go work with Dave on a tiger, I'm going to think about the experience that I have had working with domestic cats. If I'm going to work on gaur or banteng, I'm going to think about working with cattle. And I'm going to talk to my colleagues who have experience working with these species as well. So it's very important because as wildlife vets, we are expected to work with so many species that you have good networks and that you can reach out to each other here in this room and to other colleagues that you meet around the world. That includes me, and that includes Dave, and others. And so, one of the major roles and responsibilities that we just talked about of a wildlife vet is health monitoring and disease investigation. And those are slightly different. So, monitoring the health of a population is helping to understand background information. What is normally happening in this population? How many animals are born? How many die? What are the diseases that are occurring? And then when you understand normal in a population, you can start to understand abnormal, when there's a disease outbreak that is new or different or too many animals are dying. So, yeah. So one of the main experiences I have had working as a wildlife vet was working in Rwanda, Uganda, and Democratic Republic of Congo with mountain gorillas. And you may know that mountain gorillas are critically endangered. There are two different national parks, two habitats where gorillas are found. One contained about 300 gorillas when I started working, and one contained about 320. And the special thing about mountain gorillas, one of the special things, because the population is so small, every individual is genetically important to the survival of that population. And also, tourists come to visit the gorillas, and researchers have been studying the gorillas there for 30 years. And so gorillas are used to people, they're habituated, and they live in family groups. So it's possible to visit the family group, you know how many gorillas are there, and they can each be identified. And so we can actually conduct much more like human health monitoring, because we know each individual and their history. So it's a very special case. And veterinarians have been working there for 25 years in collaboration with biologists, conservationists, and the National Park Department. And part of what the project that I worked for developed is a system for regular daily health monitoring of the gorillas. And this is a system called IMPACT. Doesn't matter what the name is, but there's a paper-based system that is very simple and that is used by rangers or trackers who visit the gorillas every day. And then there is also a paper-based system or a PDA, or handheld computer-based system, that is more complicated, much more detailed, that the veterinarians use when they visit the groups. And so we collect information about how many gorillas we see and any signs of illness or abnormalities that we see. So over time we build up a database that tells us what's normal in this population. What's very important to keep in mind about wildlife epidemiology and epidemiology in general is if you see, say in this group of gorillas, 3 gorillas that are sick, it's important to know how many gorillas there are in the group. So 3 out of 6, 50% sick, is different from 3 out of 100 or 200. And so you always have to know your population at risk, or the denominator. And for us working with wildlife, in many cases, it's very hard to have a population estimate. How many gaur are in the forest? How many tigers? How many elephants? How many gibbons? It takes a lot of work, and you are always uncertain, unless you are in a situation like this with a very small population, and you can count the numbers exactly. So that's one of our challenges. Part of health monitoring and disease surveillance, as you mentioned, is conducting necropsies. So every gorilla that died would have a postmortem exam. This is a very, very old gorilla, one of the oldest that ever lived in that population, and she died of natural causes. So we are always very happy as veterinarians when an animal dies, very old, of natural causes. That's the best case. Because we have a PPE lecture and a lab later, I went to say and call myself out because I'm not yet wearing proper PPE for a necropsy, okay? We are just getting ready for the necropsy, but for the necropsy I should have long sleeves and a splash guard to protect my eyes because this is the grade A. I also worked in North Carolina where I did my PhD studies and my residency in wildlife medicine. In North Carolina, we have a very healthy black bear population, and it's actually legal to hunt black bears at certain times of the year. And so this is part of the legal hunting season for black bears. And I'm working with the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, okay, that's the wildlife authorities of the state, to make sure to survey these animals, to conduct necropsies on these bears that have been killed, to collect samples, to be able to perform disease surveillance studies. And one of the main studies that we did, because people eat the bear meat, we're concerned about zoonotic disease. And so what is this? You recognize the disease? Toxoplasma, exactly. So, we're very familiar with the domestic animal cycle, domestic cats, rodents, people, especially concerned about pregnant ladies getting toxo. So now my husband is scooping the litter box. But also toxoplasma cycles in wild populations. And the black bears in North Carolina share their habitat with a wild cat called a bobcat. Okay? And so we collected serum samples from the black bears and tested them and found that 80% were positive for toxoplasmosis. That means in this wild setting, 80% had been exposed to toxo, probably from bobcats. And so it was important for us to tell the hunters who were killing black bears and eating them that they needed to be very careful when they were preparing meat and cooking because they could get toxoplasmosis potentially from the bears. And that was important for the wildlife authorities to know. I also worked in California with a population of marine mammals. And I know there are 2 marine veterinarians here. Who are the 2 working with the... Yeah? Okay, good. I did not put anything in on turtles, because I know you're working with turtles, I'm sure. So these are northern fur seals. This is a population of animals that is not yet endangered. There are about 500,000, but there used to be 5 million. So the population is declining rapidly. And it is important for the biologists and veterinarians to try to figure out why. And so one of the things I helped with was during a few years when, during the pupping season, so these are young pups, there was unusual mortality in the pups. Too many pups were dying. And these were healthy pups. They were dead, but they were very fat. So they were good nutrition, good health status, their moms were feeding them well, but they would just be healthy one day and dead the next. And so this was a great concern, because sometimes the mortality would be 30 or 40 or 50% for the pups, and that is not sustainable for our population. And so we worked with the biologists collecting dead pups and doing post-mortem exams, necropsies, to collect samples and investigate the cause of disease. And what we found was a relationship between a parasite and a bacteria. So the parasite migration, which is normal in the fur seals, was actually transmitting a bacteria that was causing pneumonia and sudden death. And even though the parasite was normal in the fur seals, it wasn't normal at this level. So something new was happening that we are still working on trying to figure out. It might be problems with contaminants, toxins causing immune suppression. It may be problems with the food base or a complicated relationship between the 2. So this is an ongoing study. Also part of the work that I did in California with sea lions. There, in early 2003, there was a problem with sea lions showing up in California. And when sea lions get sick or injured, they come to the beaches. Okay, they haul out. There are many people and dogs on the beaches in California, so they are a threat or a risk to public health. And so a place developed in California to rescue or to pick up these stranded sea lions and other marine mammals, seals, and bring them to a rehabilitation facility to study the diseases they were suffering from, and if possible, to rehabilitate them and release them to the wild. This case of sea lions that were stranding on the beach having seizures, very unusual. And it turned out that what was happening was a bloom of algae, and the algae is producing a toxin. And the algae is eaten by sardines and small fish, and then the sea lions eat the fish. What's interesting is that people also eat sardines, right? So we eat the same food that the sea lions are eating, only we don't eat as much. So the sea lions were really serving as sentinels for a problem, a toxic problem that can affect people. The same toxin can affect people. It can cause seizures, brain damage, death, and that's what we were seeing in the sea lions. So they're serving as a very sensitive sentinel. And what I'm doing here is actually an EEG, electroencephalogram. So that's pretty fancy for wildlife medicine. We don't do that very often. But in this situation, when some of the animals may have the toxin and have seizures, they appear to recover, but then later they will continue to have seizures. And what we found is that they actually have brain damage caused by the toxin in their brain. And so once they've had a certain level of toxin, they've had a certain level of brain damage, they cannot recover. They cannot be released into the wild, and so they have to be euthanized. So this was actually testing to see if this female sea lion could be released or not. And that is a normal EEG. And this is an EEG with seizures. You can see all the spikes. So this told me that the sea lions have to be euthanized. I think I already mentioned population studies, didn't I? Okay. I'm getting used to this thing, Nancy. Yeah. So, mentioned health studies, but one of the roles that a wildlife veterinarian can play may not be related to studying the health directly. It may be as part of a team working with biologists that are studying the health of the population, the genetic structure, how many animals there are, wanting to answer basic questions about where do the animals travel, where do they migrate, what do they eat. And so this was a project in Alaska, also working with northern fur seals, the same ones that I had worked with in California. But this is a breeding colony in Alaska. And I was working with a team of biologists who were interested in placing radio transmitters, satellite transmitters on the seals to find out where the seals from this island would go to forage for food, and also where they would go when they weren't on the breeding island. And that would help them answer questions about the prey species and help them also understand maybe why the population is declining. And so my job, my only job, was to anesthetize the fur seals. Okay, this was so that the animals were safe and the biologists were safe because they were placing transmitters and collecting blood samples. And so this is my job as part of the team, is just to do the anesthesia and keep the animals safe. And these are the biologists working with the seal population. You can see here they're placing satellite transmitters and collecting blood samples. And the blood samples are shared between the biologists and the veterinarians. So the veterinarians get the blood for health studies, and the biologists have the blood to be able to study nutrition, the vitamins, minerals, fatty acid components of the blood. And so it's a really wonderful partnership. And that's the very unhappy seal waking up. This is also part of monitoring populations. The impact that the gorilla health monitoring program that I showed you earlier is a very important part of monitoring the general health and well-being of the population of mountain gorillas. And part of studying population health in a wild animal, a free-ranging animal, is that, as we mentioned, they're coming into contact with many other species. Gorillas are not just gorillas in a vacuum. They are coming into contact with buffalo in the park, with elephants, other primates, bats, and around the edges of the park with domestic animals like dogs and livestock like cattle. And so the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project, to protect the health of the gorillas, the people, the livestock, and the other wildlife, does things like a rabies vaccination campaign for dogs in the villages, and also studies tuberculosis and brucellosis and parasites in cattle and sheep and goats. And that is part of a One Health approach to wildlife medicine, which Dr. Partek will speak about more later in the workshop. Another important role for a wildlife veterinarian is recognizing and reporting reportable diseases. So there are diseases that are required that we report by national governments and by OIE and FAO. And so this is a wild buffalo from the same park where the gorillas are found. It's a year-old calf, and it was found dead outside the park. Very thin, poor body condition. I don't know if you can see, but it has big swellings on its face, over the lymph nodes. There's some evidence that they have ruptured and drained. So does this make you think of any disease in particular? Abscesses, chronic disease causing very thin animals. Very good, yeah, tuberculosis. So when I went to see this animal, I was very worried. I thought this is exactly how tuberculosis looks in Cape Buffalo. And when we cut the lesions, there are abscesses just like tuberculosis. We did a full post-mortem exam and reported to the government we may have a case of tuberculosis. We sent the samples to the lab for analysis and confirmation at an OIE reference lab, and it turned out to be actinomyces. So we were all very relieved. But it was also an indication that we needed to continue surveillance in the livestock and in the wildlife in the park, because tuberculosis is present in the livestock in the region, and it could be present in the wildlife. All of these population level studies provide samples for us for immediate analysis or samples to store long term, to have a reference bank, because sometimes you may not know about a certain disease now, but if you store samples in the future, you can test for things that you may not be able to test for now, or that may not be a problem now. And so proper collection of samples, proper storage of samples, proper recording of the data about the samples is a very important part of being a wildlife veterinarian. We mentioned for both wildlife vets and also some overlap with zoo veterinarians the importance of managing confiscated animals and possibly rehabilitating or reintroducing them if that's possible. And so this was some work that I did in Tanzania with a population of African gray parrots. There were about 120 African gray parrots that were confiscated from poachers and people that were trafficking the birds illegally. So I know that I've spoken with one of you about working with Chatterchat Market and confiscating illegal animals. So these things happen all over the world. The question is, what do you do with these animals when they're confiscated? Because often you don't know exactly where they've come from. And unless you know where they've come from, it's really not appropriate to reintroduce them. And the cost of screening for disease in this many animals, let alone providing food and a place for them to live, is extreme. It costs a lot of money. And so hard decisions have to be made sometimes. But wildlife veterinarians are on the front line of managing animals post-confiscation, especially animals like these that have come straight from the wild. So we're in the best place to know the kind of care and what those animals need in collaboration with the veterinarians that may be working with them in the future if they're taken to a rehab facility or a zoo. When I worked with the mountain gorilla project, we also had a very, very severe problem with confiscated animals. It was a time when poaching really started to happen again very frequently. So when I started working with the project in 2002, there were no animals that had been confiscated from poachers for a very long time. And by the time I finished 4 years later, we had 12 gorillas that had been confiscated from poachers. And so we had to develop, because these are mountain gorillas here, and eastern lowland gorillas, 2 different species, as well as chimpanzees and several species of monkey. We had to build a facility from scratch to be able to house these animals and care for them. And for the animals that are of very high conservation value, the mountain gorillas and the eastern lowland gorillas, the plan for those animals is still reintroduction. It will be very difficult because they will have been in captivity a long time, but that is still the plan because they are so genetically important. But again, it was the role of the wildlife veterinarians in collaboration with the biologists and the behaviorists that really knew about these animals to work as a team and develop the best way to care for them in this captive situation. Okay, human, livestock, and wildlife conflict. That's a big issue, I think, for us as wildlife veterinarians. Wildlife are being pushed into smaller and smaller areas as people take over more and more of the planet. We only have to look just here for how much development is happening and how rapidly and how natural areas are just disappearing. And so it's not unexpected that human wildlife and livestock and wildlife conflict is escalating because human populations are growing, livestock populations are growing, and we are spreading out. So we're, of course, going to come into more contact with wildlife. And I think we know that contact with wildlife and that disruption and that rapid change to the habitat is what really helps drive, in many ways, the emergence or the recognition of new diseases. And so these interfaces where we are coming into contact with wildlife, livestock, and people are very important to pay attention to. And I actually use this example from California again, from working with seals and sea lions, as a marine example of human-wildlife conflict. There's a very active, very profitable fishing industry off the coast of California. And so there's many fishing nets. Because of many different drivers, overfishing, changes to the seawater, changes in climate, many fish stocks, many fish populations are dropping fast. And so fishermen are having a harder time making a living, catching more fish. They often blame the wildlife because animals like California sea lions eat fish, and they're very smart animals. So when they see a fishing boat with a net full of fish, they're going to come and they're going to try to take fish from the net. Fishermen see this as the seals and the sea lions are stealing my fish. And so what often happens is gunshots. Okay, about 10% of the animals that came to the Marine Mammal Center where I worked had been shot with shotguns. And we see horrible injuries like this. The bottom jaw is broken. This one, often the brain is penetrated. So these are animals that have to be euthanized. Okay, that is the appropriate thing to do in this case. There are other animals that become entangled in fishing nets, either because they're trying to take fish from the net or from derelict nets that have been lost by fishing boats. And so that is actually seen as a human-induced injury, and something, because of the way the animals haul out on shore, that is relatively easy for the veterinarians to deal with. So they can catch the animal, remove the net, clean the wounds, and they can be returned to the sea. This is an example of an animal that was in an oil spill. Okay, so that, again, that is a human-induced injury to that animal. And the concept and the philosophy is, if we did it, if it's our fault that these animals are injured, we should make an effort to try to rehabilitate them. And if we cannot rehabilitate them, we should at least study and learn what we can from these animals about the population and about the diseases that they have and the things that they're experiencing in the marine environment. And this is another very extreme example of human-wildlife conflict. This is a sperm whale, a very large whale, about 40 feet long, that died. You can't see very well from this picture, but the whale was very thin. He had not been eating right for a long time. And this was actually one of 3 sperm whales that stranded within a 6-month period in the same general area, very, very thin. And so we have a team here that has climbed down these cliffs to get to the whale. And this is a team of veterinarians, biologists, veterinary technicians, and we're going to do a necropsy, a post-mortem of the whale. And what we found when we did the necropsy was, this is fishing nets. Okay, and this is all fishing nets coming out of the stomach of the whale. And so because of the way sperm whales eat, they like squid, they like cod, they come into contact with the fisheries a lot. And this whale had actually ingested about 400 pounds, about 200 kilos of net, and he was obstructed. He starved to death very slowly because of fishing nets. And there were 2 other whales in a 6-month period that also had this, starved to death because of fishing nets. So another example of human-wildlife conflict from the mountain gorilla. And you can see here, there is a gorilla on the ground, and a very large group of villagers that have surrounded the gorilla. This is actually a young male gorilla that has decided to wander outside the park. It's very unusual behavior for a gorilla. It's actually only the first time we know of that this has happened. But he's wandered far outside the park, and he's damaging farm fields. He's eating corn, sugarcane, sorghum, which has a very bad impact on the people trying to make a living. And so what you see here is a National Parks Ranger from DR Congo and a veterinarian from the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project. If the veterinarians had not been there, this gorilla would be dead. Okay, he would have been killed by the villagers, and likely he would have injured many people, and that would be bad for conservation and for the relationship between the park and the people. Because the veterinary project is there, they are able to anesthetize the gorilla and transport him back to the park. And they actually had to do this twice, 2 different times. But now he seems to have the idea and he's staying in the park. But this is an example where the veterinarian was able to save an important member of an endangered species because he was part of the team. And I mentioned individual animal care, that in certain circumstances for wildlife, that this can be an important part of the job. When the animals we're talking about are endangered species, very small populations. And again, back to California, to the Marine Mammal Center. Some of the populations of animals there are very healthy. California sea lions, there are thousands, 250,000. That population is growing and is healthy. But this is a stellar sea lion. Closely related species is endangered and the population is declining. This is also a northern fur seal. I mentioned that their populations are declining as well. So this Marine Mammal Center, which was set up to take care mostly of common species, is also taking care of individuals of endangered and threatened species. And one of the important things about a center like this is that by working with common species in rehabilitation, you can learn about how to best treat endangered species so that you're not practicing on an endangered species for the first time. You could try something with a sea lion, a common sea lion, so that when you have a stellar sea lion, you know how to best treat that animal. And this is just part of what happens with the rehabilitation center there, caring for individual animals. Even for the species that are common, this is an opportunity to learn about the population of animals, because we get a sample from these animals that are sick or injured. We can collect blood samples, tissue samples, and learn about what's happening in the population. We also learn about proper nutrition for all of these animals as well, so that can help inform how to feed these animals in captivity in zoos. And for the individual animals that are successfully rehabilitated, they can be released back to the natural environment after they've been tested to make sure that they are free from diseases that we don't want to reintroduce to the natural environment. And only about 50% of the animals that come into the rehabilitation facility are released. The rest are euthanized because either their injuries or their illness is too severe, or because they have some disease we're concerned about transmitting back to the wild. This is another unusual example from California with 2 humpback whales, okay, also endangered species. That's a mother and a baby. And you can see they have injuries on the side. They were both struck by a boat, by a ship. And this is here in the Pacific Ocean, close to San Francisco. San Francisco is right here. So the whales were struck by a ship and injured, and we think they became disoriented. They swam into San Francisco Bay and up to the Sacramento River, which is fresh water. Whales are supposed to be in the marine environment, not in fresh water. So it was not a healthy place for them. Also very busy from boat traffic and people using the Sacramento River for recreation. And you can see that they developed skin infections and infections of their wounds. This was very worrisome because these are endangered species, and it was a female and a female calf, so very important for reproductive potential. So we did something very unusual, which was in consultation again with a large team of biologists, veterinarians that are specialists working with whales and other large animals. We developed a plan to try to treat these whales with antibiotics. This was the first time this has ever been done in free-swimming whales. And luckily, for an unrelated project, colleagues had developed a dart gun to use with whales, to be able to deliver drugs to whales. The gun was developed to use to deliver sedative drugs to whales that are entangled in fishing nets or fishing lines, but it can also give antibiotics. And so we were able to give antibiotics for the first time to a whale. It took a lot of consultation with drug companies to figure out the best drug to give. Pharmacokinetics. We don't know anything about drug dosages in humpback whales. We know a little bit from captivity from killer whales, but that's a different whale altogether. So it was a team effort of making a best educated guess about the drug to use and the dosage. But 24 hours later, maybe because we poked them with big sharp things, the whales swam back to the ocean, and we're waiting to hopefully recite them again. So both were successfully returned to the ocean. That was a huge effort. It cost a lot of money and took a lot of time. And we only did that because it was two endangered, members of an endangered species, two females. And back to the gorillas. I mentioned earlier that every gorilla in this population is genetically important to the population. And so the veterinarians there treat the gorillas whenever they have a problem that's related to a human-caused injury, so a snare, or infectious disease that we think may be transmitted from people or that is life-threatening. There are many things that gorillas do in the wild that can cause death. That is just natural gorilla behavior. Gorillas fight with each other. Males commit infanticide. When they come into a new group, they may kill young infants. That's all natural gorilla behavior. We don't treat that. We don't treat injuries from fighting. We don't try to treat things that are the result of natural gorilla behavior. We treat injuries and illness caused by people only. And this is an example of a snare wound. This is a young gorilla who had a metal snare around his neck. And you can see the wound here. If the veterinarians had not been there to treat him, he would have died because the snare would have cut his carotid arteries and he would have died. And they remove many snares every year and also treat cases of pneumonia. And again, these examples of intervening to treat individual animals produce lots of samples for biological banking and for testing for disease surveillance. So everything is connected in these types of projects. And a recent study has shown with the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project, the population of gorillas is growing, which is a wonderful success story for very, very endangered animals in a very difficult part of the world where there's a lot of conflict, a lot of war, a lot of transboundary problems there. And the veterinary program has made a contribution to that population growth of an extra 2% per year, which may not sound like a lot, but population growth without the veterinary program is about 1.5% to 2%. With the veterinary program, it's 4% or double. And so that's an example of the type of contribution that wildlife veterinarians can make to endangered species conservation. And I think I highlighted many times during this listed examples of experiences I've had how important collaboration is. I said I've never worked in the field as a wildlife vet by myself. I'm always working with a team that includes veterinary technicians, biologists, trackers, rangers, law enforcement. So it's really important to have those types of connections and work as a team. So here with the field in Alaska, remember these were biologists, and this was the majority of the work was being done by the biologists. I was there to provide my skill to the biology team so that we could safely anesthetize the animals, and they could place transmitters and collect samples to study the population. And with the mountain gorillas, even more teamwork, because the national park system we're working in is actually in 3 countries. It's one habitat, but shared by 3 countries. And those 3 countries, Rwanda, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Uganda, have all had major conflicts in the past 15 years. Civil war, genocide, terrible things happening across those borders. But the amazing thing is that the conservation teams and the biologists on the ground, working in the national park, working to protect the wildlife, work very well together. And they have actually developed a model of being able to cooperate across those borders that has served as a model for the government. They showed that this kind of cooperation was possible, and now that transboundary collaboration has been ratified by the government, and they have an agreement to cooperate among the 3 countries for conservation. So just to give you an example, this one picture was for the team that was responsible for immobilizing and anesthetizing a gorilla in Congo. And in this team we have rangers from Congo, from DR Congo. We have rangers from Rwanda. We have a veterinarian, 2 veterinarians from Congo, a veterinarian from Uganda. That guy there, a veterinarian from the United States, who happens to be my husband. And we have biologists from Rwanda. So it's a big team of people, and the work that we did would not be possible without that entire team. The team from Rwanda and Uganda was much more experienced at immobilizing gorillas. The team from Congo did not have so much experience with immobilization, but they knew their gorilla groups. And so we all worked together for the benefit of those gorillas. And it's a really wonderful thing, because I learned something every time I go in the field with biologists and with the trackers and the rangers, and I hope they learn something from me every time. And that's it. So I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. I just wanted to give you some examples of experiences I've had and opportunities to work with wildlife, and there's things that are possible for you as well. Any questions? Everything's perfectly clear? No questions?
They have some, what do you call it? Some humanosis.
What?
Humanosis.
Humanosis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, in the group of gorilla.
Yeah.
Can you describe something?
I can. Yes. We talk a lot about wildlife as sources of emerging infectious diseases and wildlife as sources of zoonosis for livestock and people. And what is often left out of the conversation is the role that we play. We have diseases, and we can pass them to animals, our pets, our livestock, and also to wildlife. And so, for the mountain gorillas, they're so closely related to us, and most of them are habituated to people. They are visited by people every day, whether they be researchers, biologists, and trackers, or tourists. So it's possible as a tourist to come from Bangkok or New York City, and within 24 hours of leaving your home, you can be sitting on the side of a mountain in Rwanda visiting a group of gorillas. And so one of the main concerns that we have for the mountain gorillas and their conservation is the risk of pathogens, viruses, and bacteria being introduced not only from livestock, but from people, because there's such human pressure on those animals. And it's possible to get too close, very close, to mountain gorillas. So there are rules and regulations about staying a certain distance from the gorillas. In case you cough or sneeze, you're not going to transmit. But the gorillas don't know those rules, so sometimes they will approach you more closely than that. There are now discussions underway to require tourists to wear masks when they visit the gorillas, which the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project is supportive of that idea. It's just, it takes a while to change practices and to change people's perception. The biggest cause of death in the mountain gorillas, aside from trauma, so trauma is the #1 cause of death, either from poaching or from natural trauma from just being a gorilla. After trauma, the most common cause of death is pneumonia. Okay, and there's very strong indications that viruses and bacteria transmitted from people may be involved in causing these outbreaks of respiratory disease. So I think that's Dr. Partek's point, that there are also many other examples of people transmitting pathogens to wildlife in captivity and also in the wild. There are very famous cases of people with tuberculosis infecting elephants with tuberculosis, right? There are also cases, and I think we know very well from swine flu, of people contracting the swine influenza virus and working in swine farms, but then transmitting it to other swine farms. So people introducing, we can serve as vectors just like animals can. And so it's important, it's part of the story we have to tell as wildlife veterinarians, that wildlife are not just the scapegoat and the source of disease. We rely on them for a lot of things. I'll talk about some of those later, I think, with Dave Smith. But we know that wildlife plays a very important role. And so we have a role as an advocate for the wildlife. And I think Dr. Partek tells a good story about that with avian influenza. And we know that everybody wanted to blame the wild birds and exterminate the wild birds, and that will take care of influenza, but we know that's not really the way. So. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for staying awake.
ฮัลโหลค่ะ ต่อไปก็พักเที่ยงค่ะ1 ชั่วโมงนะคะ ก็กลับมาเจอกันก็คือบ่ายโมง15 นาทีนะคะสำหรับผู้ที่เพิ่งมานะคะ หลังจากรับประทานอาหารเสร็จแล้วเรียนเชิญทำพิธีค่ะ